you know where your documents were in let's say the 7th level of a document tree, but no colleague would go looking for them. But an AI is really easily able to look for those documents, and that's where it starts to be really important to determine which user and which AI or agent is able to access which documents. So that it's basically hiring ethical hackers to figure out if they can find a way in that isn't supposed to be there. And in my experience so far, we've done quite some pen tests, and there have been 0 where there haven't been any vulnerabilities reported. One of the things that we discovered quite quickly was almost all tools use the same underlying LLM, so large language models. And one of the interesting things is there's no magic on the model end, so it's all about the extra information the systems are able to provide. Now that I'm in the industry for a bit longer, I start to notice that there are very few engineers crazy enough to enter the legal profession. So I'm happy to meet a fellow engineer in this podcast.
Welcome back to Rogue's Legal AI Conversations. Today I'm joined by Elgar Weijtmans, Head of Technology at HVG Law. We get straight into what's actually under the hood of legal AI, why most tools run on the same models, what context really means, how AI applications are actually constructed, and what to ask vendors about security, data flow, and access control. Let's jump straight in. Okay, so Elgar, I'm really happy we're doing this. I've been living in the Netherlands for the past 5 years, so apologize for my bluntness, but who are you, and why should our audience care about what we're going to talk about today?
I think that's a good question, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I am the head of technology at HVG Law, a relatively large law firm in the Netherlands that has a strategic partnership with EY. And at EY, we have around 3,000 to 4,000 lawyers, so quite a lot. And the reason I think I'm in this podcast is because I have both a technical engineering background and a legal background. And now that I'm in the industry for a bit longer, I start to notice that there are very few engineers crazy enough to enter the legal profession. So I'm happy to meet a fellow engineer in this podcast.
That's I think it's pretty rare to see that. It's more common the other way around, right? Now
Right.
With the boom of AI and all the technologies around it, people are jumping into trying to figure out the technologies from the legal perspective.
Right. I see some lawyers trying to vibe code as well. So exciting times.
Yeah, exciting times. I think as an engineer, we're both very familiar with vibe coding.
Yeah.
But there's a way of, what I like to give as a parallel is imagine a non-lawyer using ChatGPT to come up with a contract.
Right.
Then reverse it and think of a lawyer or a non-technical person trying to vibe code their super complex system.
Right. I think that's a very close analogy, but with one detail is that I think is different. In the case of a non-lawyer creating a contract, you can still actually read the contract. But if you're a non-techie, you get program code, which is or source code, which might be harder to read than legal documents, I think, for a non-lawyer, but I'm not sure.
It's a sensitive topic, and
it is.
The other day I was listening to a podcast with Cody Sanchez. She's a business person in the US, and one thing she said is that she doesn't want to be friends with people that have nothing online that can later on bite them in the ass.
I must say I try to be quite conscious of what I put online, but the more I write, the harder that gets. I don't know how that is for you, but you want to write some interesting stuff, and I realized that at some point some of it might bite me in the ass.
Yeah. I read a couple of your articles, super insightful, and thank you. Please keep on continuing with this, because there's as you've been sitting on both sides, on the legal side and on the engineering side, it's super interesting to see your perspectives on it. And I think that you said in one of them that most legal AI tools are using the same underlying models, right?
Right.
But then the difference in the output is because of the context.
Right.
What do you mean by context?
So I think this is a very interesting topic because most lawyers are now at a point where they realize they want to use AI, but they don't know which AI they should use. So I think just about every lawyer has used ChatGPT by now either privately or in their law firm environment. But there are now also these legal AI providers, and they seem to provide some sort of extra magic on top of the normal AI solutions like Claude and ChatGPT that we all know. And one of the things I try to figure out is what's the difference, the delta between a normal AI system that we all know, like ChatGPT, and a specialized AI solution like, for example, Harvey or Legora. And in order to figure that out, we try to look under the hood of these systems to understand how they work. And one of the things that we discovered quite quickly was almost all tools use the same underlying LLM, so large language models. Those are the, let's say, AIs that provide the answer to the user. So when I chat with, for example, ChatGPT, the ChatGPT will answer my questions or try to execute my tasks. I think all lawyers by now have used AI, for example, ChatGPT, and everyone is trying to figure out which AI they should use in their daily work. And that can either be a generic model like OpenAI's ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude, or there are these specialized legal AI solutions like Harvey and Legora. And I think everyone is wondering what's the difference between them. And we were too. So we tried to figure out what was going on under the hood of these systems. And one thing we quite quickly understood was almost all legal AI solutions like Harvey and Legora use the same underlying model. So, for example, Claude or ChatGPT. And what they add on top of that is what we call context. So extra information the AI can use to generate an answer properly. So it's basically like adding extra info to your prompt, and so that can either be, for example, the system prompt, the instruction that the provider adds to a system, or your own prompt that everyone provides to chat with an AI, or the documents that I upload as a user. But most importantly, if I work with legal documents or legal sources, the legal AI gets and adds to my prompt, so it is better able to provide me an answer. And one of the interesting things is there's no magic on the model end. So there's very few providers that have like trained legal models. And from what we've seen, the trained legal models are underperforming the general models. It's all about the extra information the systems are able to provide. So the general models like ChatGPT are better able to answer your query or question.
So on a very basic level, what happens between a user typing a question into their screen and seeing the answer?
Well, I have some graphics that might help us if that's useful for you. It's much easier for me to show you in a visual way. So what we've seen is almost all AIs, either generic or legal, are using the same model. So it's either ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude, or Gemini from Google. And then the context is where the magic happens. And in order to understand where the magic happens, you have to know what happens in a regular setup. So if I'm, for example, using ChatGPT, I enter my prompt, that's my query, to the AI. It goes to the underlying system, the LLM, large language model, and it then will generate a response. And it's like I'm doing an exam, but I'm not able to or not allowed to bring my legal books to the exam. So I have to remember what I was learning along the way and then provide an answer based on that. So this is how I would say ChatGPT works. And so there's very little context added here, because all the context that we have is the system prompt from, in this case, for example, ChatGPT, and my own input, which is my own prompt. So I'll pause here before I go towards what legal AI systems do. Any questions on this end, Rock?
Yeah, just one. How, if I compare this to ChatGPT,
right,
which is an application. And we could go later into explaining what's the difference between an AI model and an actual application.
Right.
I compare this to ChatGPT. What does this allow me? What benefit does this give me that ChatGPT doesn't?
So this is basically the core functionality of ChatGPT. So what we're seeing right now, there's no added benefits. This is great if I'm asking ChatGPT to provide me with a recipe for a cheesecake. This is not great if I want to ask ChatGPT for the latest case law on torts, for example, because it will generate an answer based on its generic, let's say, memory that it got from the training data instead of actual legal sources. And what you probably would like as a lawyer is a system that is able to provide the extra information, the context, so the AI is able to provide an answer based on actual legal data instead of generic training data that it remembered from its training phase. Moving on. So this is great as a starting point because this is how everything starts. But if you look at how, for example, legal AIs work, especially the better ones, they add an extra layer. So this looks quite complex, but it's actually quite simple. So there are these legal sources, for example, case law and statutes, that are converted to a format that an AI can understand. And that's step one. And then step two, that those legal sources are stored in a special kind of database, in this case, a vector database, which you can compare with, for example, a library where instead of having all the sources being sorted A to Z, they're sorted by topic. And then whenever I enter a prompt, I enter an instruction for my AI, my prompt is also sent to that library, and the librarian, in this case, the vector database, is going to check which sources are closest to whatever I'm prompting to my AI, and then it will provide you, and that's step 5, the sources that are closest to what I'm asking for. And one of the things that we'll dive into, I think, later on a bit more is it will provide chunks of text, so similar pieces of text based on a semantic similarity. So there's no legal reasoning here. It's just text that looks or sounds very similar to my prompt. It will add that, just combine it with my prompt, and then go through the process that we just saw. So there's basically two phases here. There's the phase where the AI provider converts all these sources, usually every 24 hours, and puts them in a database. And then there's the step where relevant chunks are added to my prompt, and based on that, an answer is provided. So instead of having the AI generate an answer based on its generic training data, it will try to generate an answer based on its generic training data, plus the extra information that the vector database has provided. And so the magic here is that it adds these extra chunks of text, so the AI knows at least something about the legal context that you're requiring to answer the question.
How does it know what is the mechanism behind determining what is a similar type of text?
That's probably the hardest question. So the retrieval of the right pieces of text is where the difference is between a terrible legal AI and a great legal AI. So taking a step back, in most cases, I don't think lawyers need a legal AI, because if you're able as a user to provide your own context, you don't need these systems doing that behind the scenes. If you know which case law the AI needs to use to provide you with an answer, provide it yourself instead of relying on a system like this. But there are, of course, use cases where you do need a system that provides this extra information. And this is, and there are basically two ways of approaching this. The one way is the semantic approach, or let's say there are three ways to approach this. So the old school way is keyword search. So you have a text, I'm looking for certain keywords, and the system will just start counting how many times the certain word is in the document. And the more a keyword is in a document, the higher relevancy it puts on that document. So that's very old school. That's how Google used to work 15 years ago. Then the second is the one that we're seeing here right now, which is the semantic way. So the sources are converted into what we call vectors, and they're saved in such a way that they're that the text that looks similar for an AI are put together. And when I'm looking for a certain type of information, the vector database will look for all the documents that are very close to what I'm entering myself in my prompt, and then on a semantic way try to answer the question. The trick with this is that with legal documents, they can look very close from a semantic point of view, but they, from a legal reasoning point of view, they can be completely different or irrelevant. So one of the trickiest parts is to create a system that is able to mimic legal reasoning in such a way that legal documents are added to my prompt only when they're relevant, not when they're semantically similar, but not relevant. Because the AI will be able to generate a great answer based on good data, but will also be able to create a very bad summary of bad sources. So garbage in is garbage out, basically. And then there's a third way. And usually AI providers or legal AI providers use a combination, and that's a so-called knowledge graph, where instead of putting data or sources in a library based on semantic similarity, they try to construct all the relationships between all sources. And I'll show some graphs about that in a moment, because it's much easier to explain when visualizing it instead of trying to explain it from an abstract point of view.
Is there a rule of thumb? What type of... Okay, so we're talking currently about information retrieval system, which is basically half of the system of any kind of AI system, right? One is something that generates an answer, and that's not what we're talking about currently. That one finds the information that the AI needs to be able to come up with as accurate of an answer as possible.
Right.
And is there a rule of thumb? Okay, for those types of use cases, we should use vector-based retrieval layer, and for that other type of tasks, we should use knowledge graph. Is it?
Yeah.
Yes,
absolutely. I think there's a big difference, because this is not a legal problem like you rightfully mentioned. It's an AI problem, but the legal use cases are quite particular because legal reasoning is quite particular. If for example, you're using a system like this to look up company policy, it's actually, I think, quite a good practice to use a semantic search, because usually if you're looking, for example, for a branding guide, the vector search or the semantic search will do quite a good job finding your branding guide if you provide a prompt that is close to what the vector looks like. But with legal documents, especially with legal research, if you're looking for case law or statutes or a combination, then it can be quite tricky, because case law can look very similar in some cases, where one case is, for example, a torts case law, and the other is, for example, a contracts case law, but the semantic meaning looks very similar to an AI. So that's where a knowledge graph comes in, because then it can explicitly look for relations between themes and topics instead of looking for, let's say, semantic similarity. So summarizing, I think if you're not doing legal research and just looking for generic documents, for example, company policies, that's where vector databases work really well. But once you enter the nitty-gritty stuff of legal dependencies and legal reasoning, that's where I think a knowledge graph shines in the retrieval part of this graph.
If I am a managing partner that is looking into a couple of tools that I would like to test, and I know what my problem is, I know what I need to get solved.
Yeah.
What are some questions that I should ask my legal AI vendors or the ones that are pitching to me?
I think that's a great question. I think the first step is to determine which problem are you looking to solve with AI. So there are a million different problems you can solve with AI, but I think the first step is figuring out which ones you want to tackle first. So in our case, for example, automating administrative work was the first step into getting people used to using AI. But it could easily also be helping drafting memos, legal memos, and doing legal research. So depending on your use case, the questions vary a bit. But what we are seeing from our own inquiry with these vendors is because everyone is a startup at this point, because the market is only 2 years old, there's still a phase where everyone is trying to get to a point where the systems are compliant with our enterprise requirements. So, for example, having a vendor with an ISO certification would be preferable in our case in a larger law firm. But it's quite rare to find legal AI providers that have that, because it takes some time and actually also some investment. So what some of the vendors do, which is quite tricky, is put an ISO logo on their website and then referring to, for example, the ISO certification of their hosting provider instead of their own ISO certification. And I don't have to tell you this, I think, Rock, but an IT system or any engineering is as safe as the weakest link. And so having one link certified is not good enough in our case. So if I'd have to provide 3 questions for a similar law firm that's also looking for a tool that is good at legal research and safe to use, I'd say 1, look for full certification at least, not just for one of the links in the chain. Look for a provider that keeps all your data within the EU, so not just your client data, but also uses an underlying model like ChatGPT or Claude or the one from Google.
Gemini.
Gemini, there you go. Sorry.
In the end, we're not even looking at the models anymore, because everything else is so much more important than who even knows the names of those models anymore.
Exactly, it's a carousel, and what can be the best model today will be the number 3 tomorrow. So we are benchmarking all of them, and we had this funny situation where Gemini 3 Pro was the best one for 2 days. and then Claude Opus 4.5 was released, and it beat Gemini 3 Pro on our legal benchmark. So indeed, it's still it's still interesting to see which models perform better with legal reasoning, but it's all the other stuff that is more exciting to me. So getting back to the questions that you could ask a vendor or a provider of a legal AI is the full platform ISO certified or SOC 2 Type 2 certified? Does all the data stay within the EU? And then look particularly for where the model is hosted, because sometimes you see that the application is hosted within the EU, but they're using, for example, a US-based model. And I think it's good to note that all great models are US-based models, but they can still be hosted within the EU, and that's what you're looking for. And thirdly, but that's very specifically for legal research, I would look for a provider that has figured out that they need a knowledge graph to provide the context for legal queries. And that's quite hard to audit from the outside, but I'm seeing more and more legal AI providers figure that out at the moment. And I think it's a good indicator that they know what they're doing. So those 3 questions: is the full chain ISO certified? Does all the data, including the model itself, stay within the EU? And if you're interested in legal research, are they using a knowledge graph? Those are, I think, 3 great starting questions for a AI provider.
Route. You mentioned benchmarks. There's
Yes.
so much talks about benchmarks, and I think they're getting also abused a little bit, trying to justify that the system or the application is really good because it's getting great results based on the benchmarks.
Yeah.
From a very practical standpoint, what kind of benchmarks are you looking at, and how do you even look at benchmarks? Do you just take what's out there, or do you have something of your own that you've come up with?
For everyone that hasn't tried creating a benchmark, creating benchmarks is incredibly hard. And there are basically two types of benchmarks. There's the trust me bro benchmark, where no one knows what's going on behind the scenes, but you have to trust the outcome. And to be fair, ours is a trust me bro benchmark, because we created a benchmark based on our own internal data. So we're not able to provide that to, for example, other people in the industry. And the other thing is almost all benchmarks are basically vibe checks. So evals are very important. As a software engineer, you're used to writing tests to check if your system works the way you envision it working. But with AI, it's much harder because there's an aspect of unpredictability to how it behaves. So there's no situation where I know if I put in X, the output will always be Y. So that's where evals or benchmarks come in. And they're basically similar to exams. So if I take a legal exam, the professor will ask me a number of questions and will score my answer based on completeness, my writing skills, if I cite the right sources. And I think this goes for almost all benchmarks, not just legal ones, but particularly for legal benchmarks, I think they're quite close to law school exams, because you're just trying to figure out if the AI is able to reliably produce an output that you would also expect from a human. And in our case, it took us over a year and a half to come up with something useful by just looking out at our own use cases and then trying to reverse engineer them into exams that we can provide to different AI systems to have a feeling of how they behave in a legal context. But by no measure, I would say this is a definitive answer to the question: is this a good or bad legal AI? It's basically a check. Does it perform well on the tests that we set out for it? And it's also quite hard to have an absolute score. I think the relevant scores or the scores related to each other are more important than the absolute scores, because what we see, for example, is that some models like Google's model Gemini lagged a bit in the legal reasoning department, and they made a big improvement with Gemini 3 Pro, and that's quite easy to measure to see if there are big improvements or not. But it's quite hard to have a good benchmark where you are comparing two different models against each other. That's a long way to saying it's really hard and be very skeptical of anyone trying to rely on a benchmark, because it's also very subjective. And for us, it was very useful because there wasn't anything that we could rely on back then. And the experience of creating one was also very insightful. But I'm very happy that there are now open source initiatives that also try to tackle the same problem of testing how well AIs work for legal problems.
Yeah, that's true. And also, like, I noticed the other day, like when we're talking about evals, there's two types of evals. Evals that can be done by an end user, such as a company using a product, or
Right.
evals done by a company that is actually developing the product, because then they have the access to the source code, and then they're going, when it comes to evaluating, they're going way deeper. But
Right.
when an end user, basically, they only have access to the control over the input and output. And then basically they should evaluate whether it works on the scope of tasks that they want to use AI on, right? So it's
Right.
like It's always a little bit of work to get there, and then basically when you expand your AI use on different tasks, those evals that you designed, they're not going to work. You're going to have to come up with something else. It's a different.
Right.
So it's pretty hard.
And I think it's particularly hard if you're not the provider to know what's happening, because there could be a number of variables that change when the output of an eval changes. So it could be just a change in the system prompt, but it could also be that there's a new snapshot of a model that is better suited for a task. So that's why we also developed quite some internal prototypes along with our benchmark, not because we want to eventually create our own products, but we really wanted to figure out what was happening behind the scenes in order to figure out which questions we should ask to evaluate the models and the legal AI solutions.
Yeah. You mentioned that this whole industry is pretty young. Everybody's a startup at this point,
right.
Even the AI providers, the model providers. And so we touched a little bit upon the complexities of a RAG system. For anybody
right.
that doesn't know what's RAG, it's a retrieval augmented generation, right? It's basically you have either an AI model or you have the whole system. And the whole system looks like what you described and showed us before with the slides, with the animations. Yep. Either it has vector search in behind or it has knowledge graph. There's many different ways. So we can imagine why, an argument of, but our system is very accurate because it has RAG is
right.
a very loaded statement, right? And
right.
so is also like we can guarantee accuracy because we have evals is also a loaded statement because, well, who did those evals? How do they look like? How deep do they go? Like all of those things around that. So right. How hard it is when you are a bigger law firm and you're trying to... I'm specifically asking for bigger law firms because if it's hard for bigger law firms, we can imagine how harder it is then for smaller ones. But how hard it is to get those types of informations, this type of information from the legal AI vendors?
Well, I think it's quite easy to get an answer, but it's quite hard to understand or evaluate what that answer means. So there's, when looking at, I think we looked at a long list of around 40, 50 legal AI solutions. They all look quite similar when looking at their marketing material, but we actually had a chance to sit down with their developers and draw their engineering efforts on a whiteboard and know how everything works under the hood. And I think that's quite rare to have that chance in the first place, but also to have people that understand that. So that's a long way to say it's really hard. And that's why I'm advocating both internally and also with my colleagues from other firms to open source that information, because it's really important as an industry to push in the right direction. And if you don't share that information, it's really hard. And for us, that's also still quite a challenge because traditionally as lawyers, we want to protect all the knowledge that we have and all the information. And as a technologist, I prefer sharing as much as possible because I think this is not a zero-sum game. We can grow the pie instead of slice it. But trying to convince everyone to agree with me on that is quite hard. And I think it's the only way to have smaller law firms get some insight of what's going on if we openly share that information. Because otherwise, you either need some very talented engineers at those law firms, or you need very transparent providers, and usually neither are the case.
Let's talk about third parties, shall we?
All right.
You mentioned drawing out the engineering, let's say, architecture of those solutions. How does it look? How hard it is to figure out where does the data travel? Not just where does it end, but who has access to it?
Right. And that's, I must say, although I have an engineering background, I also need expert opinions from people that are far more knowledgeable on this topic than me. So what we always do before we engage a third party, like in this case a legal AI provider, is we do a full penetration test, a pen test, and that's a white box test. So we also have access to their source code to, on that level, very granularly look at what the data flow looks like, and that starts with which sources do they use and where do they get them from, and usually it's web scraping. How do they do that? Is that data stored? What happens to the data that we provide to a system? Where does it go? Does it flow to a third-party provider that just does the generation, which in 99% of the cases that's the case, and what does that chain look like? And I think from a generic point of view, I think I understand all the elements, but you actually need more skilled engineers to understand what's going on a granular level.
Like doctors are specialized in certain areas, that's how also us engineers are specialized in certain areas.
And even for doctors, I can be a general practitioner, but I can also be a brain surgeon. And I think in this case, a brain surgeon would be more suitable than how I would consider myself as a general practitioner.
You mentioned pen testing.
Right.
What is that?
So it's basically hiring ethical hackers to figure out if they can find a way in that isn't supposed to be there. And in my experience so far, we've done quite some pen tests, and there have been 0 where there haven't been any vulnerabilities reported. And it varies broadly between very basic vulnerabilities that are easy to fix to very substantial ones. And we did a pen test on OpenAI, where our initial provider, when we used ChatGPT, and we did the same on our current legal AI provider. And in all cases, there were some vulnerabilities reported, but they're quite easily fixed. But the reason why we do that is you can have this ISO certification that's more of a, let's say, security framework that in the best case is used and followed by the provider. But that doesn't always mean that in practice there aren't any issues or vulnerabilities. And the best way to assess that is to have hackers find those vulnerabilities and report them to you independently. That way you'll have an idea if anything, if your vendor is transparent about how their system works and their known vulnerabilities, but also how mature a system is. Because if you find very basic, for example, permission-based issues, they're too early in their development stage to work with, or if it's a very simple and low risk vulnerability that is reported, it's much easier to say, let's fix this in the next 2 weeks, and then we're ready to roll this out across our law firm.
And when you do find some vulnerabilities that are, let's say, on the application level of the legal AI vendor, how collaborative are they in fixing them?
In our experience, or my experience so far, they've been quite great. So it also depends on how the collaboration works from the beginning. So we hire a top-tier pen test firm, so they know they're getting quality feedback. We all have that annoyance getting feedback from amateurs. In this case, you get feedback from the pros. That's usually always welcomed by engineers. And also, in most cases, they're able to leverage whatever the findings are also with other potential customers. So although there's a risk of finding something really tricky, it's always also a chance for the provider to improve and to show to other potential customers that they're on the right track. And so far with the providers that we've worked with, that last one was the case.
That's funny. So that does ring a few bells from my enterprise days when GenAI came. We were tech first financial company. We were developing products that were being used by customers.
Right.
Those customers being small and big companies, and also enterprises. And so I remember when Gen AI came and we started, putting some development efforts into developing these types of products. The security teams were going completely crazy because they said, "Oh my God, we had system level cracks that we were supposed to patch and monitor and test, but now we also have this probabilistic element, non-deterministic AI."
Yeah.
And this thing just basically you give it some sort of text and it returns some sort of text, right?
Yes.
And it's like, prompt injections. We're in the industry, there's a lot of talks about prompt injections today.
Right.
Super fancy word. What it is, it's basically sending some text to the LLM and asking it to do something. And you ask it in a very different way, it's going to give you a very different reply. So also if you hide some instructions, let's say with just like white text, or maybe something in the footer, or maybe something in the metadata of the file, LLM actually reads that as well and it reacts to it.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, because earlier in the conversation we said that more or less the legal AI vendors or any kind of AI vendors today that are building products are using the same set of, approximately 6 models in the AI models in the background. Yeah. Are there any mutual denominators when it comes to, that attack surface, attacking AI?
Well, to be completely fair, the prompt injections are usually the last thing we worry about, because if that's the attack surface, it's actually a good sign because all the other things are engineered correctly. The things that we worry most about is role-based access control, how are security tokens handled, let's say the basic engineering stuff. And if all of that is set up correctly, then we start looking at the attack surface that revolves around the actual model itself. But from what we've seen, let's say the use cases or the situations where that's a high-risk situation are very limited, and that's because we only work with systems that don't go out on the internet, for example. So that's a very conscious choice. If you have, for example, a legal AI or a generic AI that has internet access, then you can start using prompt injections to have the web search tool do things that it shouldn't. And for example, expose your client data to whatever source. Or if you're using an agentic feature where it starts to take over your browser, that's where it starts to be really tricky, especially when it comes to prompt injections. But in our case, our system is, let's say, completely encapsulated within our own environment. So a best case scenario, if I'm a hacker and if I have a successful prompt injection, I'm only going to hurt myself because let's say the overall security measures are not controlled by the LLM. So for example, the role-based access control, who has access to what, can never be touched by the LLM. It's always a static system. And for us, so it's a conscious choice to disable any web functionality because that's where it gets tricky and you start opening up attack surfaces, both from internal to go outside, but also the other way around. You can create all kinds of potential attacks to have the search feature fetch information that it shouldn't.
When you're talking about role-based access control, I'm immediately jumping into agentic AI and MCP.
Right.
So MCP is a new development paradigm in how do you basically, with the least effort, enable the most access to your AI agent to all the systems that you basically have.
Yeah.
So our audience understands why role-based access control, which is the absolute basic, is so important. Why is it so important when it comes to agentic and agentic systems?
So it's always super important. So for example, if you look at your company systems, there are different roles. There's an administrator that has access to everything, and there are default users that only have, for example, access to your own inbox. And that's a great start. You don't want to have everyone have access to everyone's inbox for many kinds of reasons. And the same goes for AI, but it's extra important for AI because, that's a good segue to agentic systems. Let's say a basic LLM will take your input and then as a probabilistic system generate an output, that's a very simple step. But if you start to add functionality to an AI where it by itself can determine what to do when and why, there are all these micro decisions that can be influenced by the AI, where there's no. I think that the idea of agentic systems is that there's no human in the loop. There's no human checking what's going on. And that's why it's extra important to have these different roles and permissions, because you want to set them up front so there's no situation where the AI can exceed, for example, their permissions whenever doing agentic stuff on their own.
How can I, as an end user, as a law firm, how can I, or a legal team in an enterprise, like an in-house counsel, how can I, if I'm working with a legal AI vendor, what should I require from them when it comes to control to what that AI agent has access to?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because more people will have that problem than they think, I think. A good example is Microsoft Copilot. I think just about everyone has Copilot at the moment. I doubt how many people are actually using it on a day-to-day basis, but that's a different discussion.
That's one of those that's going to bite us in the ass.
When I apply at Microsoft, they'll look back at this podcast. But that's a great example, because everyone has their company data usually on SharePoint. And previously, there was this situation where even if you didn't have proper role-based access control, you knew where your documents were in let's say the 7th level of a document tree, but no colleague would go looking for them. But an AI is really easily able to look for those documents, and that's where it starts to be really important to determine which user and which AI or agent is able to access which documents. And that goes for Microsoft Copilot, where now all of a sudden with one query I can look for, let's say, performance reviews of one of my colleagues. And if the role-based access control isn't set up properly, I'll get an answer with an actual document. So that's, let's say, I think the most practical point where people need to start thinking about agents and role-based access control, but also with platforms that have access to third-party knowledge. You have to start thinking about which data is needed where and when and by who, and you need to do that upfront. You can never do that afterwards, because these systems only get messier over time. They're never getting more structured over time. So the best way to do that is doing that upfront. And I know that's quite hard, especially in law firms where you have all this historic data, and that it hopefully in all cases is properly secured and has the right roles and permissions. But from my experience, that is still quite a challenge.
Let's mention briefly guardrails. There's so much talk about them, and they're also used as, those buzzwords like RAG. I have RAG, so it's accurate. I have benchmarks, so it's okay.
Right.
Well, we have guardrails, so everything is safe. Why is that a loaded statement?
Yeah, so it's a loaded statement because going back to what we previously discussed, there's no situation where I know if I put in X, the answer will always be Y. So knowing when guardrails need to be applied is really hard, and applying them properly is also quite hard, because there, as we would call as engineers, there's a million different edge cases, situations that you don't think of up front, but you still need to cover because they could happen in some situations. And so I think guardrails are a great starting point if you apply them well. But they're just like vendors that say our system doesn't hallucinate. That's impossible. That would be a big red flag if a vendor tries to convince you of that fact. And the same goes for guardrails. If a vendor says our system will never, for example, expose your client data to the internet because we have guardrails, I think at this point that's practically impossible, because there's always ways like prompt engineering or prompt injections to convince an AI to do things that the guardrails should prevent. And because it's not a matter of like an old school firewall where, you know, if a request comes from a certain IP address, I need to block it. And if an IP comes and a request comes from a different IP, I can allow it. That's very deterministic, and I know what needs to happen in which case. In the case of LLMs, it's basically a prediction where we don't know what's going to happen at some point. And that's also why, for example, having self-driving cars work is so hard, because you have to think of all these edge cases up front, because if you don't think about them, they will cause havoc along the way. And these guardrails are both in self-driving cars, but also in AI systems that lawyers use. And they work most of the time, but they could also not work when they really should.
I wanted to ask you one question, and this could go, we can have another podcast about this, but it's big tech versus open source.
Right.
Okay, let's speak from what is happening on the ground today. On the ground, I think most of the law firms are using big models because they're using conversational AI. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But for conversational AI, if you want to get something useful out of it, it should really be massive. Meaning it should be trained, it should have billions parameters, it should be trained on massive amounts of data. From that perspective, open source models don't really work that well because they're pretty small. Okay, yes, you have big ones, but I mean, we both know what it takes money-wise to run a 760 billion parameter model, right? Like it's a massive investment up front. But from what you've been experimenting and testing, could you identify some use cases where open source models could do well already today?
So this is a very interesting question, because there are so many levels and aspects to this question. I think starting off by asking ourselves, why don't companies use open models more? And I think it's always, in case of AI, a matter of optimization. So you can optimize for quality, for efficiency or speed, and price. And it's usually, like in most software engineering, in best case, 2 out of 3. And with these Gen AI solutions where you have a conversation with an AI, you always want to optimize for quality, because we're still improving rapidly, but we're not at the point where we're happy with the result all the time. So let's say in general, we still need more improvements on the quality aspect, so we can make decisions to not focus on either efficiency or price that much. So that's why all big law firms, and I think also smaller law firms, will go for the mainstream models, because they optimize for quality and they work best for most legal cases and also for non-legal cases. But we're nearing a point where the quality starts to matter less, because they're working so well that you can optimize for other aspects like efficiency and price. And I don't think we'll get to a point, for example, in 2026, where these models are so good that we can start optimizing just for price and efficiency and forget about the quality. And for, let's say, big conversational systems, you will always need large language models in the near future. But there are like these micro steps in, for example, a workflow. For example, classifying documents or figuring out if you even need sources to answer questions. So if I develop a system as a legal AI provider, I don't want to use all my engineering efforts and resources for every question. So if one of the users asks for a recipe of a cheesecake, there is a micro step in there determining, does that question require legal sources or not? And if the answer is no, it will go through a simplified flow. These micro decisions don't require these huge language models. I think you could do that with smaller ones and even open source ones. And I think as a software engineer, I get extra happy about open source models because I not only know which answers they provide when I'm trying to run them through my exam, I can also look at how they were trained and which design choices were made along the way, so I can better check if they align with what I expect from them. So if hypothetically we would be at the point where the open source models would be as good as the closed source ones, we would definitely go for the open source ones. But we now have to live with the fact that, at least for now, only the large closed source models are good enough from a quality perspective to work on a day-to-day basis.
If you would want the leadership of law firms to get, I want to say, like, if you want people to take one thing out of this podcast, but right. I'm not going to limit you that much. If you want a couple of important things to be taken out of this podcast around limitations of AI, or maybe point them into a direction, where should they be thinking about with AI?
So I hope the audience of this podcast is a bit more technical than the usual lawyer. So usually my best advice would be just use AI on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't matter really what you use it for. It can be for creating a grocery list every day, or for helping you draft your first legal brief. It doesn't matter. It's just the matter of getting hands-on experience on a day-to-day basis that makes the most difference in the long run. But given the fact that I hopefully will address a more technical audience in this case, I think the benefit of actually playing and building with systems and building systems is enormous. So in our case, we have developed 15, 20 different prototypes, and they will never be put in practice. But I think it's the best investment that we've done so far in order to understand what's really going on. And they're also just a lot of fun to develop. So I have fellow engineers in my team that enjoy building these every once in a while. And now with AI-assisted coding, it's much easier than it was before. So if you're in a position where you're able to actually build some stuff yourself, go do it. Don't let yourself be limited by the fact that you might think, I need to bring this tool into production. Just the process of building prototypes for different use cases is so insightful and fun that it's, in most cases, I think, worth the time investment.
And even for non-engineers, I mean, you mentioned vibe coding, which is a super accessible way to try, but also they have, I mean, probably I haven't worked with a law firm that doesn't have my MS365, right? So then you have Power Automate, and then you can use, it's an easy way to try with certain workflows.
Oh God, Power Automate. Yes, but
like everybody uses MS365, so.
Right. Yeah, and you're right. And I can be nitpicky about which tools I like and which I don't, but the truth is the tools that you're using are the right tools to use. So it doesn't really matter in most cases, as long as you're in a safe, secured environment. Go play with it. Give it a try. Whether it's Power Automate or vibe coding your own solution, or testing a drag and drop solution where minimal coding skills are required. There's so much possibility. Start looking at N8N, for example, where you can build these elaborate workflows and test them along the way. It's a lot of fun, and it's also very insightful of how things work. I think for me, that's the moment where things started to click. I've, of course, studied RAG systems and studied all these different retrieval methods. But it's very different when you see them in practice and start to figure out when things don't work, and especially why they don't work. And that really helped us to be better at what we're doing, but also make better decisions, because we were able to ask the right questions to both our own internal people, trying to understand which problems we were trying to solve, but also to the vendors to figure out how they really try to build their systems, and not only today, but also tomorrow. Getting an understanding of where an AI provider wants to go and how they envision their system within, for example, your law firm is much easier to understand if you build a couple yourself.
What would you advise?
Right.
Where would you point them towards? What is the foundational mistake that you would warn them before trying to fiddle with AI?
Let me think about that a bit. I think if I try to phrase it positively, start with low-risk stuff first. I think for most lawyers, it's very attractive to start writing legal memos and briefs, and if you feel confident doing that, please go ahead. But I've seen a lot of cases where there was a lot of over-promising and under-delivering, and that's detrimental to your adoption and also the joy of using AI. So whenever I do courses on legal AI for lawyers, I always end with don't expect more than 10% efficiency gain. Not because I think you cannot get more than 10% efficiency gain, but just to get them into the right mindset. So I think the biggest risk is having really high expectations right at the front and then be disappointed by what AI can do. If you start with low risk, easy tasks like creating grocery lists, or if you're more technical, building your first RAG system that is super simple, you will start figuring out how all of this works, because as you might have experienced as well, using AI is just as much an art as it is a science, and figuring out, getting a feeling of how things work is really, really important. And if you have a very high expectation and are disappointed in the start, I don't think you'll get at the point where you have enough experience to actually get a feeling for the artsy side of things.
That was a great answer you came up with. Thank you so much, Elgar, and see you next year.
Thank you, Rock, and see you soon. Bye.
That's it for today's episode. Big thanks to Elgar for sharing his insights. If you're serious about navigating legal AI, remember, start small, ask the right questions, and don't expect perfection right away, as Edgar said it. Now subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. See you next week.